Hello and welcome to the Tifo Football Podcast. I'm Joe Devine and I'm joined now by Alex Stewart.
Good afternoon, Joe.
Seb Stafford-Bloor.
Hi, Joe.
And the magnificent Phil Hay.
I don't know about magnificent, but good afternoon, everybody.
I do know, as does everyone listening. Thanks so much for joining us, Phil. We're really pleased to have you here. And for listeners and Leeds supporters who've been begging us to have Phil on for a while, we are doing Leeds today as part of a Sensible Transfers episode, but Phil is going to join us again in a few weeks' time so that we can do a proper chat about Leeds regarding everything else other than transfers. Before we get started today, though, I would like to remind you that if you like Tifo's Sensible Transfers series, you can find editorial pieces written about almost every club in the Premier League, some in the Championship and some in the Scottish Premier League as well, on The Athletic. And if you visit theathletic.com/Tifo Transfers, you can get 40% off an annual subscription, which works out to be about £3 a month, I think. And you can read all of those pieces, or indeed just read all of Phil's work and enjoy yourself every day of the year. But for now, I will leave you in the cool hands and the warm embrace of Phil Hay. Okay, we're going to start with Leeds United while we have Phil here. And I would like to start by getting a little bit of background information from you, Phil. The first question really is just what is the club's philosophy likely to be in this first season? Because, survival is obviously the first objective, but do we have any sense of what the club's real aim is and how much they'd be willing to spend chasing it?
Budget-wise, I think they'll be falling into the bracket of 50 to 75 million in terms of the money that they're going to put up for transfer fees. And I think they're going to have to stretch to that level to get the calibre of centre-back and centre-forward, certainly, that they're after. You're right about survival, and that kind of goes without saying any time a club goes up. I think probably more so with Leeds, given that this has been 16 years of waiting for promotion and 16 hard years as well. It's been a very, very long, difficult and in periods very unhappy journey for them up until the Bielsa era. And I think survival will be seen by them as an adequate benchmark, but probably quite a low benchmark as well. There are grander plans at play at Leeds and at Ellen Road, and one of them, for example, is the plan to redevelop the West Stand, which has been there for years and years and is fairly decrepit, but crucially is keeping the capacity of the stadium down at 35,000. If they were to redevelop that into comparable size to the East Stand over the other side of the pitch, you'd be talking about a capacity of closer to 50,000, and given that they've sold 23,000 season tickets and have a waiting list of 20,000 behind that, it's evident that in the Premier League they could fill that sort of stadium. But what they certainly realise is they cannot throw money at projects like that if they're going to yo-yo, or if they're going to be up for one season and then down again and stuck back in the EFL. It just isn't prudent. So I think what they need to see this season is not only survival, but also just that feeling of competence in the Premier League, that feeling of comfort in those surroundings, and of essentially finding their feet and beginning to establish themselves in a way which suggests that they're going to be a Premier League club indefinitely or for a very long stretch, as opposed to, in comparison to Fulham and Burnley before them, and granted Burnley got back up and look more established now, but in comparison to clubs who've come up, gone back down, and then almost had to start again.
Yeah, it's really interesting with these. In fact, and we'll come back and talk about the money that's available and some players in a moment. But Alex and Seb and I were discussing this morning, and I remember very clearly Alex saying that Leeds, of all the teams that are being promoted and have been promoted in recent seasons, you feel that they could just as easily be relegated as finish 6th or 5th. And they're sort of impossible to predict for a number of reasons, one of which I suppose is Marcelo Bielsa. What would your expectations be in terms of a league finishing position? Have you got any idea, or have you got a feel for it, Phil?
I find that as hard to answer as that suggestion, really. The idea that they could get into trouble, the idea that they could sit very comfortably higher up the league. And I think my feeling with the Premier League is that if you're defensively organised, which Leeds that have been under Bielsa to a very strong degree, and clearly they look like they've lost Ben White back to Brighton, and that changes things at the back. But the organisation is fundamentally there, I think. And if you are defensively organised with a team who like to attack, a team who are willing to attack, and a team who will, because it's just Bielsa's philosophy, it's in his nature, and that never bends or deviates, then I think you've got every chance in the league, and I think you've got every chance of being competitive. And you see every season that it really is quite similar to the Championship, really. Much of a muchness once you get into the middle of the Premier League. It isn't difficult to get sucked into problems at the bottom, but equally it isn't difficult to get a little run on a number of other teams and find that post-Christmas, like Sheffield United this season, you're comfortably safe and have got other things to concentrate on and to look at. I would like to think that, something in the region of 13th, 14th, 15th would be very possible for Leeds, if not better than that. I think what you have to remember is there are so many variables here, that there's so few players who've played in the Premier League before, or in a way that gives them any sort of meaningful experience of that division. And even somebody like Pablo Hernandez is going back there for the first time in 6 years. It's a long stretch now since he was a Premier League player, and while he's still got so much ability, it is going to be a case of finding himself again at that level. So we've got a lot to find out about this squad, and a bit to find out about Bielsa as well, because again, he hasn't worked in this division, but if you've watched him as I have for 2 years, you'd take a huge amount of confidence from the way in which he strolled into the Championship and started dominating it almost immediately.
Phil, can I ask about Pablo Hernandez, as you mentioned him there? 9 goals, 9 assists. It's one of the best seasons of his career last year, but he is 35. And is there a contingency for what happens if he's not able to replicate that kind of productivity at the level above?
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, I actually think his best season at Leeds was the previous season, Bielsa's first, when it was goals and assists from everywhere all year, and despite a couple of hamstring strains, ended up a really high tally with both, and was comfortably one of the leading contenders for the Player of the Year award, which he won again this time round. I mean, the last 9 games of this season just gone were almost like his time. It was like his calling, and he was a real force of nature in that, playing at that sort of level. The thing about Hernandez is he's got talent that you can't teach, and he does things that you can't teach, and he does things that players cannot replicate. A lot of players, regardless of how hard they try or how much they try to practice what he does, it's the nutmegs from 5 yards away, and it's the wonderful vision that pulls out some of the most difficult passes that remind you why he was a Spain international and he was playing at a very high level with Valencia. But it's quite interesting, because I think if you go back to March when lockdown began, I don't think he would necessarily have been the widespread choice for Player of the Year. I think people would have looked to others for that, the likes of Luke Ayling or Stuart Dallas or Ben White at the back, and I think it really was the blast of brilliance from Hernandez towards the end of the season that put him in line for the Player of the Year award. It's worth remembering and noting that he only started 27 games in this season gone, so it would be wrong to say that Leeds are a one-man team, and it would be wrong to say that they're excessively reliant on him. I think when it comes to those moments where you desperately need some magic or some creativity, it is a case of all fingers pointing towards Hernandez again. But they will try to sign a player who can operate as a 10 or out wide. They do have Helder Costa, who more and more has filled in and played ahead of Hernandez in that right-hand area, the right side of midfield where Bielsa loves to use him. And I think centrally as well, Bielsa is more inclined to go with 2 8s, your Matthias Cleek, and if he's fit, someone like Adam Forshaw, than he is to pair up Cleek with Hernandez. But the thing about Hernandez is he's somebody who you want in the team, and he's somebody who you want to use as much as you can. They're not oblivious to the fact that he's 35, put it that way, but they also see in him an amazing physique and amazing ability to cope with the intensity of the Championship, and I think he will cope fine in the Premier League as well. But it was always important for Leeds that while they had him in the background, they moved to a point where actually there was more to the team than merely Hernandez's brilliance. And I do think when you look at the stats and you look at who else contributed last season, and the fact that you could have had probably 6 or 7 valid contenders for Player of the Year, it tells you that he's essential, but he's not essential to the point where they can't do without him.
Who he reminds me of? Paul Merson at Portsmouth in 2002, 3, 4, something like that. His sort of last hurrah in the Championship, absolutely brilliant in that season. But talking about statistics, Phil, I know this is going to be a bit of a tired topic, but can we have a chat about Patrick Bamford? Because I feel a little bit sorry for him, because I don't think Leeds' promotion had been confirmed for more than about 24 hours before people were starting to debate whether he was actually good enough to play and score goals in the Premier League. 16 goals last season, What's your feeling for next year with him? Because he has had chances before, and these question marks never seem to go away from him, no matter how many goals he scores.
No, well, the debate about whether he is good enough for the Premier League is merely an advancement of the debate about whether he was good enough for the Championship. And I think I have to say, I think that argument has been conclusively dealt with on the basis that he's been the centre forward in a team who've won the Championship by 10 points. He scored 16 goals in a squad where nobody else really looked like getting into double figures, and own goals was right up there as one of the leading scorers this season. And I think crucially as well, he fits the mould that Bielsa looks for in a centre forward. He wants a striker who will drop deep and link up with the midfielders behind him. He wants a striker who runs the channels and will graft. He wants a striker, as much as anything else, who is very good at springing the high press, which Bamford is. And, I constantly get the feeling with Bielsa that, yes, it's important that strikers score goals, but that's almost like the last thing that he focuses on when it comes to assessing who it is that he plays up front. It's not a secret that Bamford's expected goals ratio is much higher than his actual goals tally. But even back when Bielsa had Eddie Nketiah on loan from Arsenal, and Nketiah seemed to be finishing everything that came to him and looked like the much more natural goal scorer, there was an automatic or a sort of ingrained reluctance in Bielsa to abandon Bamford and to go with Nketiah. And as Nketiah got more chances and as he started to play up front in Bielsa's specific system, because I know Nketiah's done well down at Arsenal, he seems to have fitted in well under Arteta, but with Bielsa, it never felt quite right. And you almost got the feeling that when Nketiah went in January and he stuck with Bamford, that actually he'd been justified in doing so for a while. He'd worked out who suited the setup better, and ultimately it was his number 9. To answer the question for next season, I think Bamford will start at Anfield for the first weekend of the season. I think the lineup at Anfield will be very, very similar to the lineup that Bielsa was using, at its strongest towards the end of the season. And, had it been the case that Leeds had been able to get Ben White back from Brighton, you'd probably been talking about the lineup being virtually unchanged, if not unchanged completely. And that's the level of faith that Bielsa has in this team. That was the way he wanted them to transition. It was always going to be 3, 4, 5 signings at most. It was never going to be a complete reworking or a complete rethink about what they were doing. And if you're looking for Bamford's biggest supporter, Bielsa is probably it. Bielsa is probably the last person who would look at Bamford and say, he doesn't finish enough, so I don't want him. There's just so much more to Bielsa's tactical thinking than that.
Can I ask what kind of person Patrick Bamford is? Because we hear the highlights in the media about his, where he went to school and his musical ability. He seems quite a resilient personality, just in terms of he's one of those forwards that doesn't seem to be afraid of missing chances. He can deal with the chatter and the noise that surrounds his position. You've obviously spent a bit of time with him in the mixed zones and around the club. What's he like?
He's a very likeable guy, and I think you're right. I feel sorry for him in the way that whenever his background comes up for discussion, it's all about the wealth of his family and his kind of privileged upbringing, which, if you want to look at it closely and if you want to make assumptions, you can, I guess, you use that to gauge what Bamford's motivation as a professional will be. But I think it is an assumption, and I think it's a fairly cheap way of looking at things. He seems to me as committed as any other player. I think he does have natural confidence, although I don't think it's right to say that he's able to ignore the focus on him completely. I think he is aware of the chatter around him, and I think it can become quite tiresome because it is relentless, and from time to time he does get into exchanges with supporters on social media where he feels as if the results are great, Leeds are in a fantastic league position, but there's still this chirping at him about the fact that he doesn't score as many goals as he should, and he misses easy opportunities and everything else. But I think what you see with him is the advantage of a head coach who isn't wavering when it comes to selecting him. It almost felt that the more criticism there was of Bielsa, the more Bielsa's thinking hardened with regards to backing him and with regards to supporting him. And I'll say it again, a year or a year and a half of people questioning whether Bamford was good enough, and he's played almost every game up front for a side who've finished on 90 plus points and have won the league by 10. I think I think it answers itself, and I think Bamford will feel like he's been vindicated at that level. But if you look at his track record, he does still have to prove himself in the Premier League. That's not in question.
I'm just going to caveat this point by saying that I am fairly new to this conversation and have not followed the Bamford criticism in depth. So if this is a tired comparison, I apologise. Or if it's inaccurate, you'll tell me. But this conversation reminds me of Cameron Jerome, who I think it was 14-15 for Norwich, and then 2 years later when Norwich were relegated again, he scored 18 and 16 goals in the Championship, and he could just never quite make it at the Premier League level. I know that's a very extreme example, but is that something that crosses your mind at all, Phil, or is that not a fair comparison?
Yeah, well, I've never thought specifically about Cameron Jerome. I don't think it is an unfair comparison in that Cameron Jerome did score goals at this level, but I think the pool of players who found the leap quite difficult is fairly high. Equally, there are a lot of players who thrive in the Championship and have never played in the Premier League who go up to that level and actually do very, very well. I think the reason it's particularly difficult for a striker is that it comes back to the fact that you judged on your goals. And whereas, in other positions on the pitch, you can contribute and look very tidy and look, very competent without having the same pressure to chip in that way. It is always going to come back to, certainly from public perception, of how many goals does this guy score? And I think that's been the challenge for everybody at Leeds, is to appreciate actually what Bamford does away from his finishing. And that does sound a bit counterintuitive because he was a £7 million signing. He's one of the highest earners. He is predominantly there to score goals, but in the Bielsa system, he's predominantly there to lead the attack in the way that Bielsa wants him to. So I think, I think he does fall into the bracket of people who have clearly done it in the Championship, because he did for Middlesbrough before. He is a goal scorer at that level, however prolific ultimately that proves to be. But yeah, we're going to find out, I think, pretty quickly whether he can cut it properly in that league, because I do think he'll get a good run this time.
Listen, let's chat a little bit about the money available. You say the expectation, or what is potentially available, is between 50 and 75 million. 23 million pounds, as far as I can see, has been spent already. You've mentioned Helder Costa and also Joe Gelhardt. Ilan Melier's loan has been made permanent, and also Jack Harrison has extended his loan from Manchester City for another year. So what are the other positions on the pitch that you feel that that Leeds and Bielsa will be focusing on ahead of, I suppose not ahead of now, we're very close to the restart, but in the time between and perhaps after the restart, are there obvious areas of weakness to you, or obvious areas that you think that the team will look to strengthen in?
Yeah, very much so. Obvious areas. I mean, you touched on a good point there about trying to get things done before the season starts or potentially afterwards. The slight disadvantage that Leeds have is that your more established and settled teams in the Premier League can probably afford to wait for certain deals into September and right up to the deadline in October if they need to, if it's a case of waiting for other clubs to blink and to sell players. For Leeds, I mean, they have, as a starting point, a very obvious hole at centre-back now that Ben White has gone back to Brighton. And that, for example, is a position that they simply have to fill before they go to Anfield. They've tried with White. They've tried 3 times. They've had 3 bids knocked back from Brighton. That was climbed up to the highest bid of £25 million up front, which would have included, the usual add-ons, appearances, England debut, all that sort of thing. And the message that's coming back from Brighton is simply that they don't want to sell. And, because of that, the time frame is now becoming pretty tight. And I'm expecting over this weekend Leeds to look elsewhere and to try and make progress on other fronts, particularly with Robin Koch, the centre-back at Freiburg in Germany. He's been somebody that they've been scouting for a long time, somebody who they very much rate and who they think has similar attributes to White, and actually would probably come for a cheaper fee as well. So they do have fallbacks. It's just that I think there was a deadline put on the final bid with White for Brighton to say yay or nay, because it has got to that point where they cannot afford in 2 weeks' time to still be messing about with this one unless it is genuinely going to happen. They need a centre forward. I mean, I don't know how much you know about the situation with Jean-Kevin Augustin, but he came in on loan from RB Leipzig in January, right at the end of the month, and there was a provision, a clause in his contract which said that Leeds would take him permanently if they were promoted, which they obviously have been. Augustin's fitness has been a problem. He, in the end, was somebody that Bielsa decided he didn't really want. I don't think his attitude was 100% perfect. And essentially that is a deal that Leeds no longer want to do. But technically speaking, they're kind of on the hook for about 18, 19 million pounds with that one. And it is an impasse with Leipzig, because Leipzig want the money. And as much as the clause to sign him was dated, I believe, for the end of May, I think Leipzig's argument would be that in all good faith, that clause should be considered to mean if Leeds were promoted in the 2019-20 season, as opposed to, because obviously nobody anticipated the COVID shutdown, and COVID wasn't an issue at the point where he signed. So the long and short of that is that they need a centre forward. They do like Ollie Watkins at Brentford. They like Batshuayi down at Chelsea, although that one doesn't seem to have made an awful lot of progress. And aside from that, they do want another winger, a number 10. I think they've bid for Ryan Kent at Rangers. Again, first offer has been turned down, but they're very tempted to go back with a second. I think he is the sort of footballer who could cover multiple positions, and so if they were to get somebody like him, they'd have a winger there. They'd have someone who does play at 10, albeit as part of two number 10s with Gerrard at Rangers. So they don't actually have that many boxes to tick, and they don't have that many positions to fill. But we are talking now 3 weeks until the season starts, and we're yet to see one cross the line at Elland Road. So they really do need to see some progress now.
Phil, with Augustine, this might have just been idle press box gossip at the time, but I heard some very weird stories about his basic wage were he to stay at Leeds, with some very inflated figures. How much of a problem would this be if Leeds can't kind of wind this back with Leipzig?
Well, my understanding was that his basic wage at Leipzig was in the region of €90,000 a week. But I believe that to be true. I think that's accurate. And when you think of the sort of club Leipzig are, and they paid £30 million to take him from PSG, so I suspect that is accurate. Leeds have said to me that first of all, they still think that they have an argument for getting out of this deal, and they will certainly try to do so. I think even if push comes to shove and they're forced to take him, they would try to find another move for him, which I don't think is necessarily going to be easy at the level of fee that they were talking about with Leipzig. But he does still have a lot of talent. I mean, Bielsa himself spoke about Augustine and said, if this guy was fit and if this guy was in prime condition and scoring goals, you'd be talking about a £30-40 million striker. That's what we'd have on our hands. So there will, I think, be interest in him out there. It's just a case of how much money Leeds could recoup. And I mean, if Leipzig were to find themselves with alternative offers that provided the same amount of cash, then perhaps even they might be tempted to abandon the deal with Leeds and to do something else. But it seems implausible that anybody other than Leeds would look to pay that amount of money, given how little impact he made at Elland Road. Leeds say it won't affect them budget-wise in this window. They say they've got the cash to do what they need to do. But evidently, if they do get hit for it, and if they do have to pick up the bill in some way, then it's going to cost them, and it's going to be a waste of money. And there is a sort of precedent for this at Elland Road. Several years ago, they signed Cameron Stewart on loan from Hull. That was a January deal on loan, but at the point where he signed, a little like Helder Costa to Leeds last summer, he agreed that he agreed a permanent contract at that point and was due to sign in the summer. And Leeds and Massimo Cellino Renee done that, decided they didn't like him, he hadn't been good enough, they didn't want to keep him, and were ultimately forced to pay up the contract that they'd agreed, and were out of pocket to the tune of about £600,000-700,000. So this could get messy, it could get legally messy, and something tells me that Leeds are on a bit of a sticky wicket with this one.
Hey Alex, I'm going to ask you a question now about a kind of broad and long-winded question, probably, about teams with specific and clear tactical identities that are promoted from the Championship. And I'm asking this on the basis of our discussions about Norwich last summer, around this time. You and I were very bullish that they were an excellent team, which they certainly were in the Championship. We thought they'd do well in the Premier League. In fact, some other people that we spoke to also thought the same thing. And then Norwich happened this year. So what I want to ask you is, when teams are promoted from the Championship up to the Premier League and they have a clear tactical identity, not to say that Leeds are similar to Norwich in a stylistic sense, do you think that can hamper them in some cases? Is it harder to know what to expect in terms of how well that style will transition up a league?
I don't think that's the issue. I think there are two problems. Obviously, it's worth saying that Sheffield United were promoted with a clear tactical identity as well, and a particularly unusual one, and obviously didn't do too badly. So I think the issue is more, in Norwich's case specifically, they were hampered with injuries to a great degree, and also that was a very, very young side, and part of the way that they played was predicated on pace. And once you start having injuries and also have a lot of these quick young players, but who lack the experience, perhaps lack the leadership required, the three of that four starting back line were sort of 20, 21 years old. That's when the wheels come off slightly, I think. Sheffield United had more experience. They had older heads. They had kind of grizzled pros, for want of a better cliche. And I think, that would have helped Sheffield United get through difficult patches, but stay within that fixed identity. I think that's why I'm not massively concerned about Leeds. I mean, yes, there is a degree to which flexibility is helpful, and if things do start to go wrong, having a style that can be adapted, can perhaps be a little more defensive, a little more circumspect, is really helpful, and Norwich weren't able to do that. But I also think that Leeds have got players of really high calibre, people like Calvin Phillips, but they've also got people who've been there and done that, like Hernandez, like Luke Ayling, Stewart Dallas, people who can bring a degree of experience where if things don't automatically go well straight away, there is enough in the dressing room to be able to kind of coalesce around that, keep that sense of identity, not panic, and not get, dragged into something because heads start dropping. I think that was more Norwich's problem than anything else, a combination of injuries and a lack of experience.
I was just going to say, I've got a few thoughts on this as well. I mean, the comparison between Norwich and Sheffield United is a good one, I think. And I wonder whether, in the grand scheme, it has helped Sheffield United that they've been very good under Chris Wilder for a very, very long time now. This goes back to League One under him, and they've known what they are as a team. They've known what they are as a tactical unit for many, many months and quite a few seasons. I'm still sort of mildly baffled by where Norwich's form came from last season, because we went down there in August, 2 or 3 weeks into the season. Leeds won 3-0 at Carrow Road at Alcantara. No great contest that day. And there was a lot of chatter around about the possibility of Norwich needing a change of manager. That a sacking might be on the cards, that it wasn't quite working out and everything else. And clearly they came very, very good after that. But I suspect that when they went up, they didn't have the same ingrained style and ingrained understanding that Sheffield United did under Chris Wilder, and which I think to a greater degree than Norwich, Leeds should have under Bielsa. Bielsa's been here for 2 full seasons now. The tactics have been, demonstrably the same for 2 full seasons and have worked really, really well. In the main, the players understand them, the players seem very, very clued in and very happy with them. I mean, I was doing the comparison, and Leeds have gone up as champions this season with 35 goals conceded. Norwich went up the previous season with 57 goals conceded, way above Sheffield United, who finished second. And it's funny because one of my piece for The Athletic this morning was on the subject of another championship title winning team going to Anfield on the first day of the season for 2 years running. So how do Leeds avoid the same fate as Norwich, who took a real pasting over there, this time a year ago? And when I started to watch the game back and to look closely at what was happening, it was very obvious that tactically Norwich weren't great that day. They had an issue with Buendia as the right-hand side of a midfield three, drifting inside away from his flank and really giving Andy Robertson all the space he needed to tack down the left. And as everybody knows, if you give Liverpool's fullbacks space and time, then they'll absolutely murder you, and that's pretty much what went on, and they never seemed to get a grip of that. So I think there was some definite naivety there, and I just wonder if Leeds might be a bit more skilled and a bit more ready, and perhaps a bit more certain of what it is that they do.
Yeah. Hey, well, theathletic.com/Tifo transfers 40% off, and you can go and read Phil Hayes' wonderful sounding piece. We'll put a link to that in the description as well, so you can find that directly. When we come back, we're going to talk about Liverpool, but for now, it is our time to say thank you and farewell to Phil Hay. Thanks, Phil Hay.
Been a pleasure, thank you.
There he goes, the king in the north. He's left now, so we can be free to talk about Liverpool, who are also in the north. They did very little last summer, only adding Minamino in January. So there's a definite sense here of a cycle completed. I should say at this point also that we have released a Liverpool Sensible Transfers video. So there'll be some crossover, I suppose, between this. We'll try and think of some different picks as well and have a few conversations around it. But if you're interested in watching the full-length video, you can visit the Tifo Football YouTube channel to do so. And it'll be magnificent, I'm sure. Okay, Nico Williams, Harvey Elliott, Curtis Jones probably all be involved more with the first team this season, maybe Ryan Brewster too, although he might be loaned. So let's talk a little bit now on why it's important to supplement this side. It's a very difficult thing to do, I think, to maintain and turn over a championship team and continue on for the next season. It's why in the Premier League specifically we see very few teams who win back-to-back Premier League titles. So I'm going to start with you, Alex. Can you just explain to me, where do you begin with Liverpool when you have probably the best team in the league, when the vast majority of positions at your disposal are very strong? You don't want to bring in players that are going to unsettle the dressing room, if that's a thing, and you want to line up replacements for people who might be sort of aging or getting further on in their career, but at the same time, I don't know how you approach judging the level of prospect versus first team player to bring in. Do you have any answers for me?
I think the key is succession planning. And I think a good model, and possibly one that Liverpool will look at, is the RB Leipzig, RB Salzburg idea, whereby you have a clear identity and style at Leipzig, and Salzburg are expected to kind of grow players that will then potentially be available for a transfer into that system. Obviously, Liverpool don't have a feeder club in the same way, so they'll be looking at their academy to be able to do that. And I think if you benchmark some of these players, I think Curtis Jones looks particularly interesting, for example. Obviously, Nico Williams came in and excelled in that cup game against Everton. Those are players who will be happy to be around the fringes of the first team squad. They'll obviously learn from that experience. They'll be given some cup games, that kind of thing. I think Liverpool made such a strong stylistic change in the first couple of seasons that Jurgen Klopp was there, and supplemented that intelligently with transfers, that they are not the kind of club now at this point in time, particularly if Klopp is going to stay there for a long period, who need to bring in massive acquisitions, big kind of headline grabbing players to take over from somebody, because it's such a system-based team. So it's really, really hard, because footballers have egos, and I don't say that critically or pejoratively, but, you know, if you're joining a club like Liverpool, you're going to be doing it because you want to play. So I think looking around for astute acquisitions who are going to glide into a kind of holding pattern around the first team, be ready to step up, be proficient and tactically aware and intelligent enough to slot in to what is a clearly defined system. And this is why, for example, the Roberto Firmino role is so important. That's what you're looking for. They're not going to go out and probably spend, 50 or 60 million pounds again for a little while, unless potentially it's for a central defender. Okay,
just to put it out there, I'd be happy to join Liverpool without playing. I don't know if that's something that the club would be interested in.
You could be like the Andy Lonergan.
Yeah, it's certainly something I'd be interested in. I can spruce up the dressing room. I'm a friendly, happy character to have around. Good with group dynamics. I can cheer people up when they're down. So just saying, unlikely, but if it's an option, it's an option. What I wouldn't do, though, I suppose, is provide or provoke competition for places. And Seb, I know that you think this is an important aspect for Liverpool when they're considering recruitment at the moment, not just to strengthen for the sake of strengthening or to supplement the side. They're not just reinforcements. You think it's important to provoke that competition?
I think it is, Joe. I mean, it's all about attention, isn't it? And it feels particularly important given that having won the Champions League and now having won the Premier League, you could make a case for saying that a lot of these players have sort of reached the end of a cycle together. And Alex is absolutely right. Socially, it's a really delicate process because, for instance, if we wanted to provoke competition on this podcast and we brought on a fourth person, it would have to be at the expense of one of us three. And, that kind of causes issues with loyalties and friendships. And whilst obviously a little bit different, a football team isn't hugely dissimilar. But you do need to have just because at the very top level, football seems to be decided on tiny, tiny margins. And so if you get players who settle for what they've achieved, or have even like a 2 or 3% regression, then that can have a really detrimental effect on a side, particularly one like Liverpool, where cohesion is so important and the collective dynamic is imperative to the success. So it has to be the right players, has to be the right personality, and it has to be in the right position, and the improvement has to be targeted at those players who might be satisfied with their lot in their career already. That probably doesn't refer to the younger ones who've still got international caps to win and international tournaments to go to and experiences to have. But, when you start to get towards the end of your 20s as a footballer, I imagine you can, get into the habit of just staring at your mantelpiece and admiring your medal collection if you have one. So it's a tricky old process.
Are you happy with your lot, Seb?
No. But I mean, what I would say is just picking up on your group dynamic effect and how good you are for teamwork. You did in fact send me prosecco. I'm getting married tomorrow, which is Saturday.
Congratulations!
And you took the time to send chocolates to my future wife and prosecco to me. But you also put on it, enjoy your day, get back to work soon, which I felt was kind of passive aggressive.
Sure. Well, listen, it was unbranded Prosecco. We all know that's the best kind. I'm curious to know how you have decided to attribute the chocolates to your wife and the Prosecco to you. I will say that they were designed as a joint gift for both of you to share.
Well,
so I'm surprised that,
It's because when I opened the box in which they're in, they were grabbed from the box before I could really take...
Yeah, the decision was made for you.
Yeah, exactly.
Alex, I think you were going to make a sensible point about football before we interrupted.
I was going to try. I take Seb's point about complacency. I think that there's a lot about the degree to which managers can alleviate that through the way that they manage that group dynamic. I think it is entirely plausible that some footballers are like that. I would be very surprised if you had players like that in the Liverpool dressing room, because the way Klopp has built a sense of persistent struggle that, they are moving forwards collectively as a squad of players, also as a club in general, to be fair. I don't think there's any room for passengers in that. So I think while that might be an applicable point widely, I don't think it's an applicable point to Liverpool.
Exactly why I'm not there, even if I'm not playing. Let's start then with some picks, because in this case... Firmino and an understudy for Firmino. This is something that we've talked about before. I think we talked about it in January or last summer when we made a Liverpool Sensible Transfers video. We've done it again because it's a very important position, and it's not the most obvious replacement. I think that's why it makes for interesting discussion. So of course, we don't know what's going to happen in January as a result of the pandemic, but there is an Africa Cup of Nations scheduled in 2021. So Mane and Salah will be going if it does happen, which does leave quite a lot of pressure on Firmino's shoulders anyway. As an approach to replacing him or finding an understudy for him, Alex, how do you go about that? Who are some names, and how do you think that January might affect him if the Africa Cup of Nations does go ahead?
Well, Minamino was brought in as that. I think that was kind of very much the understanding of that. I think the Africa Cup of Nations will be a real headache for them if it does occur and they lose both of those guys. Elliott could be one to come in there. I suspect what you'd see is an adaptation of style, where potentially for a period of time you would expect to see two strikers, or maybe Origi playing on one side, Elliott on the other, to try and mitigate that. But I would also possibly think that you'd have an expectation that midfielders, there would be selection changes around the midfield, so you'd have a more attacking presence coming out of midfield, maybe someone like Oxlade-Chamberlain or Keita if he's fit. Oh no, Keita might probably be gone.
Or Thiago Alcantara.
Well, yeah, Thiago. Well, no, because he's not that kind of player.
I just mean from a deeper position progressively speaking.
Yeah, but I'm talking about people who will actually get into the box, get in ahead make runs beyond Firmino and score, because it is, it's noticeable how much of the concentration of goal scoring comes from that front three as opposed to anyone else. I mean, in terms of a Firmino replacement, it's incredibly difficult. I think you're looking probably more at attacking midfielders who can occasionally play as strikers rather than the other way around. Daiichi Kamada, who's at Eintracht Frankfurt, yes, I am mentioning another Eintracht Frankfurt player, is an attacking midfielder who plays behind usually a front two, but has scored 8 goals, 6 assists. He is in the video. I think potentially somebody like that who naturally positionally plays in that sort of area is going to be easier to teach to get forwards than it is to be able to get a centre forward to play as more of a dropping off. Because Firmino is not a false nine in the classic sense. He's not somebody who drops off to run into space. He's somebody who drops off to link up, to feed balls in ahead, and then get in on the box. So I think you're looking for an attacking midfielder. Kamada seems to fit that bill quite neatly. But then maybe Minamino will, if he's given opportunities, he'll really impress. And I doubt Liverpool are going to have spent a lot of money on somebody who isn't able to fulfill that role because their scouting is so astute.
Yeah. Okay. Well, listen, I'll move on then to centre back position. Dejan Lovren, of course, has been sold. What are your thoughts here, Alex?
So I think somebody who we were just discussing with the great Phil Hay, Ben White, would actually stylistically fit into Liverpool probably better than anywhere else. He would give them the ability to carry the ball from deep. He would give them a long-range passing ability, which would free up some of the onus on Virgil van Dijk to be the only one who's doing that, because you can possibly, if you're really good, you can press Van Dijk and try and cut Liverpool off at source. If they had a similar player in the right-sided centre-back slot, which Ben White certainly can be if he develops at the same rate, then that would give them options. There is a guy who I really like called Johannes Handel, who's at Austria Wien. He's 6'5". He's only 22. He still looks a little bit gawky, as you'd expect from a player of that height, and he's kind of a bit stringy. But
hey.
Yeah, all right. You're not stringy, mate, are you? Let's be honest.
No, that's true. I'm buff.
But
that's what they say.
Yeah, no, it's all those chest compression. No, that's something different. He's a very, very good progressive passer of the ball. He's actually better at controlling the ball in tight spaces than you'd necessarily expect. Aerially, obviously dominant as a 6'5" player. Austria Wien are quite a progressive side. They play nice football. The centre backs are encouraged to spray the ball around or try and look for nice vertical passes up the centre. So yeah, I mean he's very much an outside shout. It would be a big step up, but as a 22-year-old who's been schooled well in football and has the physical capabilities, he's somebody that might be worth looking at.
Okay, and listen, let's finally talk about Thiago Alcantara. I know we spoke of him already, but there would have been a discussion otherwise about a utility midfielder. The transfer seems likely now, so if that does happen, obviously Liverpool aren't going to add further in that area. You've talked about some of his merits already. How do you think this is going to change the team overall, and will it be, in a significant way?
I think it will be in a significant way. I mean, Thiago currently is used to playing as the sort of deeper lying, more creative player in a double pivot, which is what Bayern Munich have been doing since Hansi Flick took over. He has played as the deepest midfielder in a 3 as well, where obviously Liverpool have tended to use Fabinho as a kind of dynamic screening presence instead. I think what it does is it gives Liverpool an option. Thiago is 29. He has had some injury problems, but he is still absolutely a world-class midfielder. In that position, in that role, he's one of the world's best. I think Liverpool's issue is that, and they've turned it into a strength, let's be honest, because of the personnel they've had available, but so much of their initial creativity comes from the fullbacks. And what Thiago would allow them to do is either control the tempo of games by having a pivot who is really, really good at taking the ball under pressure, very press resistant, as a good midfielder in Germany would have to be, and then switching the play. That would allow them to get the ball out to the fullbacks without the fullbacks having to be responsible for that early transition in the first instance. He's also astute enough to be able to screen. He doesn't have the physicality of Fabinho, obviously, but he's an intelligent player. He's good at interceptions. He's good at reading the game. And there would be a more kind of central midfield area to progress the ball forwards to the front three. I could see him linking really well with Firmino dropping off. It means that Liverpool aren't quite so focused on creating chances through the flanks. It gives them something different. And I think that's the other way to almost to throw this right back to your question at the beginning about how do Liverpool adapt a championship winning team and a Champions League winning team, is to allow for options. When the system is so harmonious and well ingrained, that's great, but you can figure out ways sometimes of stopping that, and having the opportunity to just add creativity in a different position, give yourself different ways to progress the ball forwards, adjust the balance of the midfield. I think it's a very smart move. People will look at somebody of his age and injury record and say, is he worth £30 million? Absolutely he is, I think, yes.
Okay. I like the idea of, you won't be expecting this, so I like the idea of him scrabbling to unmute his microphone. But producer Adonis, do you think Liverpool are going to win the league?
Yeah.
That's nice. Nice little input there. No editing the pause between my asking the question and you answering. That's outlawed.
Well, you can't now, can you? Because you've referenced it.
No. Okay, listen, thanks everyone. When we come back, we'll be talking about Sheffield United.
Alex, in our in the editorial version of Sensible Transfers, we picked a goalkeeper. Since then, though, United have signed Wes Foderingham and also, for a very large fee, Aaron Ramsdale from relegated Bournemouth. So where are we going next? I reckon a right-sided centre-half, which makes sense, actually, because Chris Basham is 32 now, and his only cover is the 38-year-old Phil Jagielka. He's actually older than me, Christ. So can we have can we have a younger type to compete for that role, please, Alex?
Yes, you can. I just quickly say about Ramsdale, I'm not wholly convinced by this signing.
Oh, explain yourself, because I really like him.
I really like him as a goalkeeper, but I think Sheffield United are a team that want a goalkeeper who's really dominant on crosses, because they like to be able to have the centre-backs thinking about pushing straight up. And Bournemouth, I think, had one of the highest numbers of crosses into the penalty area of all teams last season, which is understandable because they weren't very good. And Ramsdale successfully claimed or stopped an incredibly low percentage of them. He's a very good shot stopper. He's a very promising goalkeeper. But I just wonder if there's a stylistic issue there that he's not dominant enough at coming out and claiming crosses, and that might be a weakness that teams can target. That's all I'd say on that one. Centre halves, this is really difficult because Sheffield United have got such a clear identity. Obviously, everybody knows and bangs on about their overlapping centre-backs. But that means, I think, that you're looking for certain kind of characteristics. You want centre-backs that can carry the ball. You want centre-backs, ideally, who are used to some sort of system that is similar. Although, arguably, there are very, very few top-level teams that are doing anything as innovative as Chris Wilder and Alan Miller. So I went to Atalanta first, and then I thought that Rafael Toloi is too old. So I discounted that. What I have thought about is a couple of guys at Stuttgart. The reason for this is that Tim Walter, who was the coach of Stuttgart before he got sacked, because he's a difficult character, apparently, he encourages his centre-backs to step forwards a lot. So one of them will play a pass and then move up into the midfield space. So he very often leaves like what you call the pivot position, the kind of central defensive midfield position, quite open. So the centre-backs are moving up centrally. Now, that's not the same as what Chris Wilder is doing, But the reason I think it's applicable is that those centre-backs will have been coached in how to move forwards, how to continue passing moves, how to leave their position and not just play a sensible pass and then drop back a little bit for an option. So on the left-hand side, you've got Marc-Oliver Kempf, who's someone that we've talked about in Sensible Transfer videos before. On the right, you've got Pascal Stenzel. Now, Stenzel's just signed as a permanent, so he wouldn't be available this summer. But as somebody to look for maybe next year, that might well be an option, because these are clearly intelligent, positionally astute centre-backs who can be coached into a more kind of attacking role. If you'll let me just bang on for two more choices, if that's okay.
Go on then. I can give you a little bit of time to think, if you like, and insert a controversial opinion, which I've been harbouring for a couple of months during lockdown. I actually think, just to kind of further your point about how ingrained their identity is, I think Jack O'Connell was one of the outstanding centre-halves last season, and I would kind of hope over the next sort of 6 months or so, if his form holds, he gets a chance with England.
To me, that's not a controversial opinion.
Good.
I think that's just straightforwardly the case.
Good. Well, we've segued nicely, so let us have more of your picks, please.
So just two more. The first is a very niche one. It's a guy called Durian Maduro, who is a centre-back for the Ajax under-19s team. He is only 5'10", which granted is a bit of a problem. But he is an incredibly elegant passer of the ball. But what really catches the eye is his ability to bring it out. He's also quick. And I think centre-backs who are able to carry the ball at pace and break opposition lines with that ball carrying as well as with their passing are the sort of players who could fit in under Wilder. He's only 19 as well. So I think there's plenty of scope there to develop and mould a player into the Sheffield United system. The other one, also quite niche, is a guy called Ofri Arad, who I really, really like. He's at Maccabi Haifa over in Israel. He's 21, he's 6 foot, he's strong, physical. Again, what catches the eye is his ability to bring the ball forwards. He's got a really, really nice range of passing. He's also a very physically committed defender. He'll throw himself into challenges, not in a stupid way, but he will put his body on the line in order to clear the ball or win it back. But when he's on the ball, there's a kind of an elegance there and a desire to bring the ball forwards, to push the attack on. He'll step up into midfield occasionally. There's a really nice footballer there, I think. And those are the sorts of profiles that I think Sheffield United will be looking for. It's not a straightforward, let's get somebody in who's good at defending. They want to find a player. Almost maybe you'd have to teach them more of the defensive fundamentals, but you want a player who's intelligent, who is progressive, who's looking to take the ball forwards and do interesting things with it. And finding that in the centre-back is really, really tricky.
Okay, interesting. Actually, while you were talking, big defensive boost for Sheffield United. They've just announced that John Egan has signed a new contract and is committed to the club till 2024, which is good. We'll move on to midfield because a couple of things have happened. John Lundstrom's contract impasse remains immovable. I think the club will triggered an automatic extension, but there is no agreement further beyond that further year. Also, they need more goals. They spent heavily on Ollie McBurney. They've got Lys Mousset, who tailed off a little bit towards the second half of the season, but enjoyed a very good first half, so they'll probably persevere with him. Rikario Zivkovic joined in January as well. He was a little bit of a punt, but I'm sure he had a couple of good moments for the end of the season. But we probably need, with Sanderberg signed to kind of bolster the defensive half of the midfield, probably need a few more goals, a little bit more creativity at the midfield tip. Do we have picks from you, Alex?
Yeah, so I think Lys Mousset is a really interesting case just to mention briefly. Like, his per 90 metrics are insanely good. And with him, it's clearly a question of sustained fitness over 90 minutes. So I think if Chris Wilder is able to get him functioning for full matches, they've got a really, really good player on their hands there. It's just this kind of tendency to drop off or only be able to play in fits and starts because of fitness reasons. So I think they probably will be able to get more goals out of their strike force in the future. There's a guy at Mainz called Jean-Paul Beritius, who I think came up possibly in the last.
I think he's come up a couple of times in our last few pods.
Yeah, so he's a really interesting player. He crops up as statistically good for certain things. And when I'm trying to remember what I was looking for, but it was a sort of somebody to come in and play behind, maybe it was a Firmino replacement, I don't know, but him and Andre Duja, who was at loan at Norwich but is now back at Hertha Berlin, were two guys who really stood out as attacking midfielders who were very smart, very, very good at pressing, could weigh in with goals by getting ahead of an attacking line and finishing moves off. Boetius, it's more with his feet. Duda, it's quite often with his head. But also had the ability to play a through pass and to be quite clever with possession. So either of those two options, I mean, Hertha, I think, are in a stage at the moment where they're probably sufficiently cash rich that they're not going to look to shift players on unless they have squad building issues. But the fact that Duda was on loan last season at Norwich indicates maybe he's a possibility. And he's definitely better than the player we saw at Norwich. But Boetius is somebody I really like. I think Sheffield United could probably improve their pressing game a little bit in the space. McGoldrick's been really good at it. Deeper in midfield, they've been really good at it. But maybe somebody who can come in and do that and aid McGoldrick, if it's him that starts, by pressing a little bit higher up the pitch, but also weigh in with goals and creativity, would be a smart move. And Boetius looks like the guy.
So I've got a non-sensible transfer to propose, more kind of a reckless, idealistic transfer. So I've been...
Ravel Morrison.
Not quite that reckless.
Okay.
Although be careful, because Ravel Morrison follows me on Twitter, and I have asked him like 4 times to come on the podcast. Alas, no joy. What I was going to say is that, and this is idealistic, and I know it's going to sound a little bit silly, but over the course of the summer, I've been noticing that the market for David Brooks is a little bit softer than people would have expected. There's a couple of big clubs sort of turning up their nose at him. And David Brooks is a wonderful player. Really, I mean, I know he's been injured and a year out of the game is going to damage anybody's standing. But goodness me, can you imagine adding him back to the mixture that already exists there at Bramall Lane?
I think that's a really intriguing prospect. My only issue with
if you could structure financially, like, I mean, so my idea, and this was kind of concocted during the podcast rather than before it in any kind of methodical way, but I thought if you could put together some kind of loan which alleviated the risk and said, like, we'll commit to it on the basis that there is no sort of alarming second season slump, which I really don't think will happen, but I'd love to see that. I just think it'd be he works with Wilder. I think it'd be a wonderful addition. And people would have said, if you'd said back in September, the idea of Sander Berg playing for Sheffield United would be ridiculous. You know, it's just not going to happen. But you know, there is ambition there when it's needed, and Brooks is brilliant. Anyway, I'm done with that. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I think Sander Berg was a transformational signing for Sheffield United in terms of the intent there. I think, you know, this is a player who's very, very hotly tipped a year ago, who is clearly a talented player. And by acquiring him for a considerable sum of money, Sheffield United were kind of signalling that there was the potential to move away from the kind of, you know, grizzled pro that we can teach stuff to. That's the second time I've used that expression. And towards younger players that are really exciting. I think Brooks would fit into that mould. My slight concern with that is that he tends to operate best in the kind of right half space that Ollie Norwood's kind of made his own. So I think there would have to be a degree of tactical flexibility there. But I can also envisage a world in which Brooks plays as a really attacking 10 off a single striker, and that there's less of a kind of clustering in that right half space, and Brooks is playing more centrally and using his ball carrying, using his ability to make decisions at pace, to feed the ball onto other people. If Sheffield United had a good enough single striker up front, if McBurney works out in that role, for example, I think that would be a really, really exciting addition. But I think there would be some tactical tweaks that would be required to make it work.
I like it when we all agree. I agree with everything you've said. Anyway, thanks so much for listening today, dear listener, dear downloader, if you're still with us. We'll be back in, I don't know, some days' time with more of these things. We've got about, 5 Sensible Transfers episodes left to get through, and then we'll be back to normal proceedings as of September, I believe. So thanks to you, Seb.
Thank you, Joe.
And to you, Alex.
Thank you, Joe.
And of course to producer Adonis.
Thank you, Adonis.
Yeah,
No,
he's not unmuting himself
nothing?
this time.
No, okay.
We'll...
Thanks.
Oh, there he goes.
There he is.
There he is. You can't control him, can he? When you want him, he's not there, and then when you don't want him, he just pops straight in. He's like a little ferret. Right, we'll be back soon, and good wishes to... Good wishes to producer Adonis on his holiday. Goodbye.